The YouTube algorithm is mysterious, but people have figured out that using certain terms like this, or this, or even this, will get a video demonetized or shadow banned. In worst case scenarios, using these terms can even get your entire channel deleted. Or can it? YouTubers talk, but I do not believe everything I hear. I know for certain that claiming algorithmic oppression is actually a really effective way to solicit more Patreon support. So I don't know what to believe. I could do what a lot of YouTubers do these days and bleep out any potentially problematic terms, but I just rewatched the video, and if I were to do that, this video would be 13 minutes of nonstop bleeps. So I could use acronyms or euphemisms to, cover up the offending terms, but I'm not going to do that either. I'm very critical of how our culture uses euphemisms to cover up. And I'm not going to play the game I want to criticize while I'm criticizing it. Words matter. Legal terminology matters. And I want to talk about a legal crime using legal language. I did think about making this video Patreon only and not uploading it to YouTube at all to protect this channel, but I'm not going to do that either. Ultimately, I have decided that I would rather take the risk and say what I need to say rather than stuff a sock in my mouth and choke on YouTube's hypocritical censorship standards. People can, and do, upload videos using euphemisms to encourage others to commit the crime I'm about to criticize, and that's not a problem. But my channel is going to be endangered by calling that crime out. So thank you sincerely for watching this video. Hopefully this channel will still be here in a week. We've been talking for decades about whether spanking kids is physical abuse, and obviously it is. But what if that question doesn't go far enough? What if right now it is legal in all 50 states, and a lot of other countries as well, to sexually abuse our children? What the kind of question is that? Is spanking kids sexual abuse? It definitely is. All right, I have so much to say right now, but we'll start with the basics. The law. The law doesn't say that spanking is sexual abuse. Well, actually, that's not true. Laws do recognize non-consensual spanking as sexual battery when an adult does it to another adult. I just don't think sexual battery stops being sexual battery if your victim is your child. Laws aren't the last word on morality, and ideas move faster than laws. Remember, US law also did not say that it was sexual abuse for a man to rape his wife until the 1990s. But if you look at the definition of sexual abuse, it doesn't say anything about corporal punishment. Doesn't it? There's no single definition of sexual abuse. The concept of abuse in general is a philosophical and social construct, not like a measurable scientific fact. But when I look for definitions of sexual abuse, I see sexual abuse is sexual behavior or a sexual act forced upon a woman, man, or child without their consent, and unwanted kissing or touching, unwanted rough or violent sexual activity. As I'll demonstrate, hitting a child on his or her pelvic region fits both of those descriptions. You must realize you're saying that a statistical majority of adults in the United States and around the world were sexually abused as children. How can that possibly be true when most people don't feel sexually abused? I'm glad most survivors don't feel abused, let alone sexually abused. That's wonderful, but feeling abused is not a mandatory ingredient of sexual abuse. We already recognize that it is sexual abuse to rape a person in a coma, even though the coma patient presumably doesn't feel abused, right? When Larry Nassar was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison in one of the biggest sex abuse scandals in sports history, many of his victims said that they had not recognized the abuse until years or even decades later, because at the time it didn't feel like abuse. It felt like medical care. Those feelings don't change the fact that it was sexual abuse. Before spousal rape activism gained momentum in the 1970s, there were some women who campaigned against proposed marital rape laws on the grounds that they didn't feel abused when their husbands forced them to have sex. Cultural conditioning is a hell of a drug. Look, I know you are a spanking fetishist. So maybe spanking is sexual to you and the small minority of people who share your fetish, but it's not sexual for most people, so it can't be sexual abuse. Well, that's not true either. We already know that humans can be sexually abused in ways they don't find personally sexually appealing. Like, most straight men don't find the thought of sex with another man particularly appealing, but that doesn't mean he can't be the victim of male-on-male rape. And honestly, individual personal psychology is totally irrelevant. Spanking causes an unavoidably sexual physiological response in anyone with a human body. Look at this chart of nerve dermatomes. Everything in the blue areas is served by the same set of sensory nerves. Blood flow too. When a person is spanked, blood flows down the common iliac artery to both the butt and genitals. On top of that, oxytocin, a hormone that is released during sexual arousal, can increase pain tolerance by as much as 75%. And studies have found that kids who are regularly spanked experience a surge of that sex hormone when they sense danger. Regardless of whether or not an individual has sexual feelings about the act of spanking, the fact remains that human hormones, blood flow, and nerve distribution suggest a complex biological connection to sexual physiology, which may explain why a 2021 Harvard brain scan study found that spanking elicits a similar response in children's brains to sexual abuse. If it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and elicits a similar response in a child's blood flow, nerve pathways, hormones, and brain as a duck, it might be a duck. Okay, you're making some interesting points, but sexual abuse is so much more than just anatomical. It's also cultural and social. As long as spanking kids isn't culturally recognized as sexual abuse, it isn't sexual abuse. See, now that's an interesting argument. But to be logically consistent, you'd have to also believe that every woman who was raped by her husband before roughly the 1970s was also not a victim of sexual abuse, since marital rape wasn't widely culturally recognized as sexual abuse back then. And I don't believe that. Do you? We recognize certain body parts as culturally and socially sexual, even on kids. Most parents would freak out if they were to walk into a classroom and find a teacher unnecessarily touching a child's butt. All of the body parts that are traditionally covered by swimwear or underwear are culturally sexual. We teach kids to call them private parts for a reason. But no good parent intends to sexually abuse a kid. Are you saying it's possible to accidentally sexually abuse someone? Of course it's possible to accidentally sexually abuse someone. Crimes in general don't have to be intentional. Think of manslaughter or vehicular homicide. The best examples of unintentional sexual abuse are crimes where both the victim and perpetrator are children. Many cases of child-on-child sexual abuse are situations where the perpetrator doesn't understand what he or she is doing. Oftentimes, the perpetrator was also a victim and is just repeating the abusive behavior onto the body of a new victim. That's unintentional sexual abuse. In those cases, I don't think the perpetrator is like an evil person or has malicious intent, but I do still think it's important to break these cycles of abuse. What I'm saying is, we already know that victims of sexual abuse sometimes repeat that same abusive behavior on new victims without understanding what they're doing. If everything you're saying is true, why aren't these conversations more common? Why haven't psychologists and doctors been warning parents about this risk for years? That's my question too. The only thing I can say is that the medical establishment has a history of turning a blind eye to abuse to avoid the discomfort of challenging the status quo. In a 1964 medical study that was published in the Archives of General Psychiatry, doctors, actual medical doctors, concluded that under some circumstances it was a good and healthy thing for a man to non-consensually beat his wife. They argued that wife beating had therapeutic benefits for both people involved. Just like laws can be wrong, doctors can be wrong. But isn't the fact that these conversations aren't more common just evidence that this is all your weird opinion, that no one else agrees with you on this? Trust me, it's not just my opinion. I think often of an email I received years ago from a young woman who gave me permission to anonymously share it. She wrote,
"I suffered physical and sexual abuse as a child, and that act, spanking, was a part of both. And in fundamentalist Christian homes like mine, there is more than a little sexualizing in those acts. That's part of the draw of it. They love it, and it turns them on in a big way. It took me a long time to untangle this. I do not have that fetish, but I know it is sexual behavior."
Individual personal experiences don't determine what is or isn't sexual abuse, but if even one child experiences being hit on his or her private parts as a sexual violation, that is one child too many to condone a practice that has no proven psychological or even behavioral benefits. You're attacking people's parents. You're attacking moms and dads. I don't think I am. That's exactly what you're doing. I think I'm having a conversation that needs to be had. I'm asking questions that need to be asked. Growth is painful. And if the cognitive dissonance of this conversation is too much to handle, we don't have to let it haunt us. We can let it color our perspectives on crime and abuse. If you know that your parents aren't monsters, but you're starting to wonder if maybe they did a monstrous thing, you're not alone. Over the last decade, I've had countless conversations with people who are wrestling with the idea that their childhood spankings may have been a form of sexual abuse. It's challenging, it's painful, but growth is painful. We can acknowledge complicated truths without demonizing the people we love. In fact, I think we should take a lot of pride in the capacity to do so. But parents have to do better. We all have to do better. Everyone who has ever known or loved or been a child has to be better. Weakness or social compliance or histories of trauma aren't good enough excuses to misstep at society's most sacred job. And we can't hide from complicated conversations just because they're challenging or uncomfortable or make us look at the old world in a new way. I have always known, intuitively and viscerally, that non-consensual spanking is sexual abuse. But what pushed me to finally say all of this out loud was that Harvard brain scan study. The one which found that spanking elicits a similar response in children's brains to sexual abuse. That's science. That's real science. And while it might not be enough scientific evidence to declare sweeping policy changes, it's certainly enough science to talk about. So I'm talking about it. I know a lot of people are going to reject this opinion, but if you're inclined to dismiss it, or roll your eyes or laugh it off because you don't feel like a survivor of sexual abuse, I hope you realize that's the same kind of flawed thinking that causes people to dismiss climate science because it doesn't feel like the weather outside has changed. And you're going to have to tell me how it's possible for something that causes the same effect in a child's body and brain as sexual abuse to not be sexual abuse. If this conversation has given you new questions or validated things you've always known, please don't go scream at your parents. That won't serve the cause of children's rights, and it probably won't serve your relationship with your family or your own healing process. Please remember the analogy I made about child-on-child sexual abuse. They don't understand what they're doing. But I understand, and hopefully you understand, which raises the question, what do we do now?